Just like close your eyes for a sec. Imagine you're walking through dense forest, perhaps in southeastern Zimbabwe. The air is thick with humidity. Somewhere in the distance you hear drums. Not the kind you hear at a party. These are different. They're deliberate. They're calling. And you've heard the stories. Everyone has. Don't mess with the Ndau people. They're the most feared magicians in the land. If they're offended, their spirits will hunt you down. Now, I'm not saying I believe in witchcraft, but I'm also not saying I don't. But what I'm about to tell you might just make you believe too. Welcome to the story of the Ndau people, a misunderstood and feared ethnic group. Anwangu, my ethnic group by the way. And by the end of this episode, you're going to understand why people cross the street when they see a Ndau elder coming. I'm your host, and this is Anna Ani, and let's explore and find out why this episode was titled as so. So, who exactly are the Ndau people? If you ask 10 people, you might get 10 different answers, and that's part of what makes them so fascinating. The Ndau people are indigenous to southeastern Zimbabwe, specifically the districts of Chipinge, Chimanimani, but you will also find significant portions in parts of Bikita, down in the Zambezi Valley, across the border in central Mozambique, and even in Malawi. The name Ndau itself is a mystery wrapped in an enigma. We've got multiple theories about where it comes from, and honestly, I couldn't find much agreement on that. Theory number one. In the Ndau language, Ndau just means land. Pretty straightforward, right? It's similar to their neighbors, the Manyika people, whose name translates to owners of the land. Nika means land in Shona. So when a Ndau person says Ndau yedu, they're literally saying our land. Theory number two. Some say the Nguni people gave them the name the Nguni called them Amadingi Ndau, which means those looking for a place. Okay, theory number three. This is my favorite. Apparently, the name comes from the way they greeted important people. They would kneel, clap their hands, and rhythmically chant Ndawe, Ndawe. So you can choose whichever theory seems convincing to you, but here's what we know for sure. The Ndau are descendants of Bantu migrants who came into present-day Zimbabwe from north of the Zambezi River. And when I say came into, I mean they arrived in waves. We're talking centuries of migration, conquest, and settlement. So, there are two hypotheses I found on the origins of the Ndau people. So I'm going to start with hypothesis number one, the Hungwe hypothesis. Around 700 to 800 AD, so we're talking over 1,000 years ago, the earliest known Bantu migrants settled in what's now Zimbabwe, and those were the Hungwe people. They occupied the eastern parts of the country, and their leader was named Dzivaguru, which means the Great Pool. And here's the kicker, the Musikavantu, who today are one of the major Ndau clans in Chipinge, were originally Hungwe. So when we talk about the Ndau, we're talking about a people whose ancestors have been in this region for over a millennium. Hypothesis number two. Another group, around 1000 to 1050 AD, it arrived in Zimbabwe, the Mbire people, led by a guy named the Mambiri, who apparently migrated all the way from Ethiopia. And that is quite a journey. They settled in Tanganyika first in an area they called Mbili, which is where the name Mbire comes from. And then eventually made their way down into Zimbabwe. Now the Mbire had some legendary figures about Murenga, who had children named Chaminuka Inyana. If they sound familiar to you, that probably means you have a good basis of Zimbabwean history. Chaminuka and Nanda were spirit mediums who played massive roles in the resistance against colonialism. So the Ndau have an apparent connection to the Mbirerozi peoples or group. The original Mbire invaders were of the Soko and Moyo totems, all about land animals. The Ndau today have similar totems. My totem, for example, is Moyostole. But some regional dynasties decided they wanted their own brand new totems. Why? To flex their independence, and I heard to facilitate internal mergers. Because marrying within the same totem was and still is a problem. And they needed to solve that, obviously, so that, they can have descendants. Now, let's talk about the thing that matters most to any people, land. Before the Europeans showed up, land among the Ndau was communally owned. The chief wasn't the owner, he was the trustee. Think of him as the caretaker of the land, responsible for allocating it to families, making sure everyone had enough to survive. This wasn't just a practical arrangement, it was spiritual. The Ndau, like other Shona people, believed that the land was connected to their ancestors. The spirits of the founding fathers were still in the soil. That it was their belief. This meant you couldn't just buy or sell land like it was a piece of furniture. You were part of a sacred contract with the past and the future. Lemon, who studied the Shona, put it perfectly. The unity of the tribe and land is a natural conception. It is based economically on the fact that the tribe depends exclusively on its own territory for its subsistence. It is legally supported by the occupation of successive generations of tribesmen, and religiously and magically this conception is strengthened by the belief that the founding tribal ancestors established the communal right on the land. In other words, land wasn't property, it was identity. And then the Europeans arrived. The British and the Portuguese saw things very differently. They looked at the land and saw empty space, territory, opportunity. Now, before I go on, I want you to understand something. The Ndau were not just passive victims in the story. They fought back, they resisted, but the forces they were up against were ruthless. Let me walk you through it. First, you've got the Order in Council of 1898. This law initiated racial land division in Rhodesia. It created native reserves for Africans and basically turned the rest into white-only territory. Then in 1931, you got the Learned Apportionment Act, and this one was brutal. The country was divided along racial lines. White areas constituted 51% of the land, native reserves 22%, native purchase areas 8%. Everything else was unassigned, forest, or undetermined. So the white population, a minority, got more than half the land. African majority, they got 22%. By 1950, the government decided that all European crown land should be cleared of Africans within 5 years. So they physically removed people, thousands of them. Just in 1955 alone, 346 Ndau families were evicted from the Melseta region and forced into reserves. Another 250 families were removed from the Chipinge highlands and dumped into places like Musikabantu, Mutema, and Muhusha reserves. And where were these reserves? The worst possible locations, arid places where nothing grew, mountainous terrain where farming was impossible, areas that were either too hot, dry, or too wet and cold. Let me give you an example. Nguni, the Mutema chiefdom, it was always wet and cold, causing excessive leaching and stunted growth. Maize couldn't even grow there, so the Ndau in Nguni literally starved, not because they were lazy, but because the land wouldn't produce food. One Ndau chief, Musikabantu, testified to the Carter Land Commission and said, "We rejoice to see you. We are troubled on the farms. All we want is some land where we can live with our people." You hear that? We are troubled on the farms. That's the polite way of saying, well, you've taken everything from us. This is like shit land. And the colonial government's response? Well, they blamed the Ndau for the land degradation. They said African farming methods were primitive, they were misguided and appalling. They said the African people's appalling misuse of the land was causing erosion. Now I want you to think about the audacity of that. You take a people's land that produces a lot, you force them onto the worst possible soil, you overcrowd them so much that the earth can't recover, and then you blame it solely on the practices that these people use to farm. That's not just injustice, that's like gaslighting on a massive scale. Then came the Native Land Husbandry Act of 1951. On paper, it was supposed to help. It recommended individual land rights, destalking of cattle, and contouring, but here's what the Ndau heard. You need to reduce your cattle. Why did that matter? It did, because cattle weren't just livestock to the Ndau. They were wealth, they were bride price, they were security. Telling Endowment to reduce his herd was pretty ridiculous on their part. So, what did the Ndau do? They moved across the border to Mozambique. The population numbers were a bit all over the place, but here's what I could find from general sources that there are about 2.4 million speakers of Ndau across the southern African region, mainly in Zimbabwe and Mozambique. So, population density. Let me talk about this because this explains something that is very, very important. Mozambique is about a population density of 42 people per square kilometer in the traditional Ndau lands, which Chipinge has a population density of 24 people per square kilometer. The difference between the two are important between the Ndauis in Mozambique and Chipinge in terms of the population density of the areas, because it is a reflection of colonial land policies. This became the pattern. Land shortage in Zimbabwe, head to Mozambique. Political persecution, head to Mozambique. First to grow cotton for Portuguese buyers, head deeper into Mozambique. The colonial border became meaningless to them, and you know what? To this day, the border is essentially fictional to the Ndau. I can testify to that personally. You can just walk on to the next town in the next country. Like, the border is a suggestion. We already kind of discussed the fact that their single ethnic group is divided by an artificial border that was created during the colonial period. And yet they maintain their connections. They cross back and forth, they intermarry, they share ceremonies. The border is a line on a map, not a barrier in actuality. Now let's talk about how the Ndau organize themselves, because this is where things get a little bit more interesting, at least for me personally. Their political system was based in states, Teve, Danda, and Sanga. These weren't centralized empires, they were tributary polities. Think of them as smaller kingdoms that acknowledged the authority of the bigger Roji state in the Central Highlands. So here's the setup. The chief was in charge, but he didn't operate alone. He had advisors, he had sub-chiefs. The territory was divided into what's called Mitunu, each under a hereditary ruler. Boundaries were marked by a physical feature like a river. Ndau chieftainship tends to be linear, from father to the oldest son, unlike some other groups where chieftainship might rotate between households. The Ndau keep it in the direct line of succession. But here's the thing, that's on paper. That sounds nice and orderly, but in reality, not so much. Rival brothers and uncles sometimes eliminated the rightful heir to take the throne. We're talking about cutthroat politics here. So sometimes the necks were cut, literally. And here's the spiritual component. Nothing was done without consulting the regional spirit medium or the Shiki. Spirits guided everything. Succession decisions had to receive spiritual approval. Chiefs made the ultimate decision, but rarely against the will of the sub-chiefs. So you had a system that was both autocratic and somewhat democratic at the same time. The chief had absolute power in theory, but in practice he was heavily constrained by his advisors and the spirit mediums. Now, what about the law and order? The Ndau courts sought reconciliation rather than harsh punishment, most of the time at least. But in court committing incest, you had to bring a white cow, and white cows were incredibly rare. So in practice, you were being banished effectively because where are you gonna get a white cow? So let's talk a little bit more about European contact. The first documented contact was a Portuguese missionary named João dos Santos in the 1500s. So I've got records going back 500 years. The Portuguese arrived on the scene in the 1500s. And when I say arrived, I mean they showed up looking for gold and spices, as the Portuguese did in those days. When they got there, they found an already thriving civilization. Now, the Portuguese didn't just show up and take over overnight. They established a presence along the coast of Sofala in 1505. Then they gradually started interfering in established trading relationships. Here's the part that might surprise you. In 1629, the Mutapa, that's the paramount chief of the Mutapa Empire, actually signed an agreement with the Portuguese that transformed Zimbabwe into a Portuguese colony during part of the 17th century. Zimbabwe was therefore technically a Portuguese territory for a bit of a while, but the Portuguese were not really effective in bringing in their presence wholly into the Mutapa Empire. So they were confined to the coastal areas and they didn't really establish effective control in the Mutapa Empire. The British showed up in the 1880s. Cecil John Rhodes, yes, the man whose name inspired the name Rhodesia, came with the British South Africa Company. Now, the British had a problem. They needed to legitimize their claim to the land. So, who did they turn to? King Lobengula of the Ndebele. Rhodes sent his agents to Lobengula. They promised him a salary of £100 per month, rifles, and a gunboat. In return, Lobengula signed the Rand Concession of 1888. He thought he was giving the British permission to mine minerals. What he was actually signing away was his entire kingdom. Because here's the trick. The document included Mashonaland and other adjoining territories, meaning Lobengula was supposedly the king of areas he didn't even control. That was just a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate fraud on the British people's part, or the British agents' part. When Lobengula realized this, he sent emissaries to England to repudiate the treaty, but the British ignored him. They'd already got what they wanted. Back in the Manica region, the Portuguese and the British were fighting over that territory where the Ndau lived. There was the Battle of Masekesa in 1891, which the British won, and the boundaries were drawn slightly west of the battle site, which is where the present day Eastern Highlands of Zimbabwe run along. Let's rewind and go back to the past a bit and talk about the Nguni invasion, because this is one of the most important chapters in the identity formation and the history of Ndau people. In the 1820s, there was a severe drought in southern Africa, and when people are desperate, they move. The Nguni armies began migrating northward from what's now South Africa. One Nguni chief, Aba Masani, established a short-lived kingdom inland from Sofala. In 1837, he was defeated by Soshangani, or Ngungunyana, as he was called by the Shona and Ndau people. Soshangani then established the Gaza Empire in southern Mozambique and subjugated the Ndau people. And when I say subjugated, I mean he annihilated them, like killed the men and took the women. Yeah, that's what I mean by subjugated. And like that destroyed the Ndau political system, and he appointed new leaders, Nguni people. And let me give you a sense of the brutality. If Ngungunyana caught you looking at one of his wives, he would pluck out your eyes. Men were indiscriminately killed. Young women were seized and distributed to his warriors as offerings. If a village was suspected of witchcraft, even one person, he would order the entire village destroyed. For witchcraft or cattle theft, convicts were impaled on wooden sticks and left to rot at crossroads. And I want you to understand, this wasn't hidden away. These were like public executions. Everyone saw them. Everyone was terrified. Adoption of the Nguni language and submission to Nguni culture was the only way to survive for the Ndau. So they started wearing head rings, piercing their earlobes, tattooing their bodies. These became marks of identity. The Ndau adopted Nguni cultural practices because it was safer to be part of the system than to fight it. Now, some of the Ndau took refuge among the Chopi people who had rifles from the Portuguese, but even then the Nguni Gaza Empire was relentless. So Shangane's impis incorporated several peoples, Tsonga, Manyika, Shenga, Chopi, and the Ndau. They built a new nation, and the people were collectively called Shangani. That's why you might occasionally come across the term Ndau Shangani used together. Here's something that's often missed. Nguni dominance wasn't just about killing, it was about wealth extraction. Between 1830 and 1880, the Nguni economy was based on raiding and extracting tribute. They regulated hunting and collected tax, monopolized the ivory export, and controlled cattle movement. The Ndau lost everything. The cattle were taken, the food was stolen. By the 1870s, the Ndau had stopped keeping cattle entirely. Some report that some had resorted to eating dogs to avoid starvation. And this is a people who had traditionally participated in thriving industries like metalwork, weaving, basket making, wood carving, poetry. All the industries were destroyed. In 1889, the Nguni returned to their former capital in southern Mozambique, but they forced 60 to 100,000 Ndau to accompany them on the long march there. During this long march to their capital in southern Mozambique, anyone who tried to run away was killed. Anyone who showed fatigue was killed. Some escaped, but most didn't. Their freedom only came when the Portuguese defeated Ngunguyana and exiled him to Goa. And here's the irony. The Portuguese colonizers brought relief to the oppressed Ndau. The very same colonizers who would eventually come to take their land were the ones who freed them from the Nguni. So fast forwarding to the future, there was the Mozambican Civil War from 1976 to 1992. Renamo drew support from the Shangaan in Sofala province. More than 200,000 Zimbabweans, including many Ndau, migrated into Zimbabwe. And then there was the resurgence of the Civil War in 2010, which caused more displacement, forcing more Ndau people into Zimbabwe. Alright, so we have covered a lot of stuff. Now let's talk about what makes the Ndau unique. Let's talk about their culture. Let's start with their music and dance. The Ndau has some incredible dances. There's the Muchongoyo, that's a war celebrate dance. They performed it with such intensity and it was performed to celebrate war victories. Then there's Chokoto, the dance celebrating bumper harvest. That's the we have food, let's party dance, and Chinyambera dancing that was performed to celebrate peace and harmony. What's amazing about these dances is that they still brought people together from across borders, people from both sides of Zimbabwe and Mozambique to participate and pass on the culture to the future generation. Now, here's a little fun fact I heard. I don't know whether it's true or not, but I heard, as I said before, that some people would use witchcraft in order to win this competition. These Muchongoy competitions that they held between the Mozambican and the Zimbabwean teams. Who knows, maybe they did, and it could be just a stereotype, about people being like magicians or whatever. When you were competing for the trophy for the Muchongoy competition, there were awards granted. Emujeke was given for the winner and the Bandauko for second place. Apparently it's worth summoning the spirits for, I guess, the Mujeke and the Bandauko enough to, bewitch your other teams in order to win. I also read somewhere that the best dance teams most of the time came from Mozambique. Because the Mozambican Ndau spent more time practicing, so they show up to competition with much more polished dances that intimidate the Zimbabwean teams. Now let's talk about witchcraft. Like I said before, I'm not going to say I believe in magic or witchcraft, but I'm not also going to say that I don't. I wouldn't encourage you to just Ndau spiritual capabilities. Just don't mess with them. The Ndau are often openly described by Mozambicans as the most feared black magicians. Even though historical records describe them as humble and non-violent, they're known to use magic when offended instead of violence. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I am Ndau, but I wouldn't say it's true or not true. So the traditional healers are called Nganga. They communicate with spirits. They can heal or harm using traditional medicine. Now, here's the procedure. When you've been attacked spiritually, you go to the Nganga. The Nganga first determines the nature of the spirits. They figure out if the spirit was sent by a witch or another Nganga. And then they perform a ceremony called Ukufemba. The spirit comes, introduces itself, and explains how it ended up in your family. The spirit is basically seeking justice. Now, here's something that might baffle some people, but the Nganga is believed to be able to manipulate the weather. During droughts or floods, the Nganga appeals to the Nzuzu. These are like water spirits. I'm sure in Shona they're called Njuzu, but in Ndau they're Nzuzu. They're called to fix things. They practice divination by inviting Majoka to possess them. This allows them to perceive remote places and events. They can determine who committed a crime, where lost people are, and even if someone is lying. Now, are these powers real? I don't know, I'll let you decide. But I'll tell you this, the majority of Zimbabweans fear anyone who threatens them with Ndau sorcery. Here's the thing, some Ndau say that witchcraft amongst the tribe was imported from South Africa. Ndau men working in South African mines and firms were initiated into witchcraft by South African traditional healers at a place called Mai Mai in Durban. But, who knows? So whether this power is real or not, might be more of a cultural adaptation than an ancient tradition. Either way, the reputation is here to stay. Now, let's talk about something less terrifying but sad, rather. Funerals. Funerals among the Ndau are elaborate affairs with strict dress codes. Men wear simple clothing, women have to dress more formally, with church uniforms, a head cover, and a wrap around. The dress code isn't written but enforced. If you show up in the wrong outfit, people will definitely judge you. At Ndau funeral, you'll see a fascinating blend of church uniforms and traditional elements side by side. Now let's talk about chicken, like chicken. Chicken in our culture has a cultural significance beyond being a source of food. When chicken is served, the cuts are guided by like unwritten rules. Which part you get depends on your gender, seniority, and age, whether you get like a thigh or like a wing or like some other part of the chicken. So this practice is definitely perceived by many people as discrimination, saying that it's greedy and it's demeaning to women and children. But some perceive this as a culture and not about disrespect, but perceiving traditions. I'm not sure on this one. I'm not sure on this one. Where do the Ndau stand today? Let's start with the biggest piece of news. In 2018, the Zimbabwean Constitution officially recognized Ndau as a separate language. For years, it was classified as a dialect of the Shona language. The 6 dialects, which included Ndau, Chizezuru, Chikaranga, and Chikalanga, and Chimanyika, and Chikorekore. Regardless of whether it's a dialect or it's a language of its own, the Ndau still presents a sense of identity that goes beyond academic definitions. The Ndau Festival of the Arts is a major event that promotes language use, cultural transmission, and community engagement. It's safeguarding Ndau as an intangible cultural heritage, and it's working. People are embracing their identity. The Ndau have embraced digital communication. African indigenous religious practitioners are using WhatsApp, Facebook, and even TikTok to share messages personally. I have uncles and aunts dancing mchongoyo on the internet. So like follow them, please. There was a fear that digitalization would destroy indigenous cultures, but the Ndau have proven that they can adapt. The Ndau Shangani are largely identified by names like Sakwinje, Semwayo, Simango, Sibia, Dliwayo, Dube, Makuyana, Mlambo, Mtetwa, Mhlanga, Umalo, Hlachwayo, Stole, Kwidini, Sidile, Tlakama, Bila, and Jarikia. Then give additional surnames for Zimbabwean Ndaus, for example. You find surnames like Sibanda, Moyo, Nyandoro, Magoronkosho, Dube, Semayo, and Moyana as well. But not everyone with these names is Ndau, mind you. These are Nguni names that now people adopted. You also find them in Zululand and Matebeleland too. The only one that's uniquely Ndau is Jarikia. So if you find or know Jarikia, you know that the Ndau automatically, but not Estole. The Ndau are divided into clans which all trace back their ancestry to specific ancestors. The Mulambo is acknowledged as the father of Ndau peoples. The Mulambo or the Musikavantu is considered the common ancestor. So even when they identify with different names and surnames, they're considered all descendants of the Musikavantu. The Musikavantu clan, or the clan that gave birth to the Ndau peoples, still exists and produces some of the greatest rainmakers among the Ndau people. I've yapped a lot and referenced the Amadingindao thing I was talking about, describing the possible origins of the word Ndau. Is that even if Ndau were described as people who were looking for a place for centuries, they've never had to look for a place. They had already found it. Not just on the maps in Chipinge or Mosurize, but in the identity that they built, defended, and preserved. Yeah. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed watching me yap into a spatula. And if you enjoyed this, hit the like button, subscribe, share with someone who needs to hear this history, and comment and add more to the story, because this is in no way exhaustive of any ethnic group that I may discuss on this channel. Thank you.